The ancient Romans are considered one of the most important and influential civilizations of antiquity, shaping the course of Western world history. Rome's importance was primarily manifested in its political, military, and cultural dominance of the Mediterranean. Situated in a strategic geographical position, Rome became the center of a vast empire stretching from the British Isles to the Middle East. Its central role in the Mediterranean gave it crucial importance, controlling the main trade routes and cultural exchanges between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its history is marked by a series of political, social, and cultural transformations, culminating in the transition from the Republican to the Imperial Age. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD marked the end of an era and left an enduring legacy that has profoundly shaped the Western world. According to legend, Rome was founded by Romulus on 21 April 753 BC. The date was established by Marcus Terentius Varro by calculating backwards the reigns of the 7 kings, about 35 years for each. From an archaeological point of view, we know that the area where the city of Rome stands today, like much of Latium, was inhabited by tribes dedicated to sheep, pigs, and cattle rather than agriculture. Between the 9th and 8th centuries, the first crops of wheat, vines, and olives were also developed, and it was precisely in the middle of the 8th century that a phenomenon known as Synaesism, an aggregation of these different tribes, occurred in the same period described by Varro. The origins of the city can be traced back to the gradual unification into a true urban center of the villages that had sprung up on the traditional 7 hills. These were settlements of the ancient Latin population, already present in the 10th century, to which were added to the Sabines from the mountains of the Upper Lazio and nuclei of the Etruscan merchants and artisans. The legend that Romulus and Remus were descended from Aeneas, the mythological hero from the city of Troy, is in fact a fabrication created by the propaganda of the Emperor Augustus, who wanted to ennoble his own family and that of his adoptive father, Caius Julius Caesar. Rome was certainly a monarchy when it was founded, although the kings of Rome that had been recorded are also mythological figures. Romulus, the first king, is said to have killed his brother Remus and to have marked the boundary of the city of Rome, called Pomerium. Romulus was probably one of the shepherd elders put in charge of the new settlement. Romulus was succeeded by 3 other kings from the area around Rome: Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, and Anco Marcius. The last 3 kings, according to legend, were of the Etruscan origin and were Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus. The Etruscans were the other main population in central and northern Italy. They had developed a very structured society, and the Romans were strongly influenced by Etruscan culture, both religiously, politically, and socially. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, was deposed in 509 BC, according to tradition, because of his arrogance and contempt for his fellow citizens and Roman institutions. This was probably the consequence of the decline of Etruscan power, which Rome took advantage of to gain greater autonomy. With the fall of the last king, Rome became a republic, but also at a moment of weakness. The neighboring powers thought they could take advantage of this moment of transition to finally defeat the rising power. But Rome and the Romans were much stronger and better prepared. In 496, the Latins were defeated at Lake Regillus, and in 431, other peoples of central Italy, such as the Equi, Volosians, and Sabines, were defeated at the Battle of Monte Algido. It was also the beginning of the conflict between the orders, a socio-political conflict between the patrician class and the plebeians, who were deprived of the political and civil rights of the patricians and resented the economic privileges of the aristocrats. After a series of successions, the plebeians obtained their political representatives, the tribunes, and definite access to all the magistracies. After the sack of Rome in 390 BC by the Gauls led by Brennus, the Romans began a vigorous expansion into central and southern Italy, clashing first with the Samnites and then with the Tarentines, aided by Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, a region of Greece, and extending their control from northern Calabria to the Rubicon in the north. It was during this period that the Romans suffered their first major defeat at the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 BC against the Samnites, and the famous battle against Pyrrhus at Heraclea in 280 BC, where the Romans were defeated because they were surprised by the presence of elephants belonging to the king of Epirus, animals they had never seen before. Two defeats that were important for Rome to understand its own limits and to be able to defeat its enemies in later battles. Having completed its domination of Italy, Rome turned its gaze to the Mediterranean, where the great power it was competing with was Carthage. In short, the two powers challenged each other in a war, the First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, which was won by the Romans, who gained control of part of Sicily. The Romans showed great skill in quickly learning the techniques and technologies of their opponents. The Carthaginians were in fact skilled navigators and very strong in naval battles. The Romans treasured some captured ships and replicated them, thus being able to fight with the Carthaginians on equal terms. The Second Punic War, 218 to 202 BC, was even more violent, but it is best remembered for the ingenuity of the Carthaginian leader, who took his army and elephants across Spain and the Alps to invade Italy. The Romans reacted with great intelligence and cunning, and, despite a few defeats, took advantage of the Carthaginian army's fatigue to defeat them, drive them back to Carthage, and defeat them again at Zama, near their capital. It was during these years that Rome began to extend its dominion over the Mediterranean. In the 2nd century BC, the Carthaginians were finally defeated at the end of the Third Punic War in 146 BC, when Carthage fell, completely razed to the ground by Roman troops commanded by Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. Corinth, a city that symbolized Greek resistance to Roman expansion, was also conquered and destroyed in the same year. With these two great victories, Rome abandoned its role as a regional power in the Western Mediterranean and became the undisputed superpower of the entire basin, which, not coincidentally, was renamed Mare Nostrum. The annexation of Greece led to greater contact with Hellenistic culture and sparked a debate between conservatives and innovators of Roman customs. The acceptance of Greek culture, although it raised the cultural level, was strongly opposed by the conservatives, led by figures such as Cato, who fought against the Hellenization of the Roman way of life. This class of cultures characterized the entire Republican period of Rome and was only really suppressed in the early Imperial period, by which time Rome had become a melting pot of cultures from all parts of the empire. The civil wars between Caius Marius and Lucius Sulla were the culmination of a long series of political and social conflicts that shattered the Roman Republic between the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. The Roman Republic was facing a deep economic crisis with serious social inequalities, rising taxes, and hardship for impoverished peasants. These economic tensions were reflected in the Roman army, which was increasingly made up of landless peasants fighting for citizenship and a better life. Meanwhile, the political struggles between the aristocratic factions, the Optimates and the Populares, for control of the empire's power and resources intensified. Caius Marius and Lucius Sulla emerged as leading figures in this context, both ambitious and determined to defend their political and military interests. The military reforms of Marius, who was close to the Populares, and his victories against the Optimates were opposed by Sulla, who succeeded in gaining control of Rome through a series of political and military maneuvers. Sulla's dictatorship led to a fierce repression of his opponents and the exile of Marius. However, Sulla's death, 78 BC, paved the way for the rise of two important new leaders, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus and Gaius Julius Caesar. Initially, the two were political allies and signed an important agreement called the First Triumvirate with another important politician of the time, Crassus. The agreement began as a private pact between three people, but it had a major impact on Roman politics. Tensions arose as Caesar became more powerful and ambitious, causing concern among Pompey and the Roman Senate. After the death of Crassus in 53 BC, the alliance between Caesar and Pompey broke down, leading to a series of conflicts that culminated in the Civil War of 49 to 45 BC. Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his army and political support, an act that marked the beginning of the war against Pompey and his supporters. The military campaign that followed saw epic battles, including the famous Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, in which Caesar won a resounding victory. Pompey's defeat marked the end of his career and the rise of Caesar as the most powerful man in Rome. His victory was short-lived, however, as he was assassinated in 44 BC, plunging Rome into another period of instability and leading to the subsequent rise of Octavian, the future Augustus. After Caesar's death, his adopted son Octavian, together with Caesar's first general Mark Antony and the prominent politician Lepidus, formed the Second Triumvirate, again an agreement made between the three to pacify Rome and kill the Caesaricides. However, Mark Antony and Octavian soon came into conflict over political and personal differences. Mark Antony sought to consolidate his power through an alliance with Cleopatra of Egypt, while Octavian sought to strengthen his position in Italy. The tensions culminated in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian finally defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, ending the civil war and ushering in the era of the Roman Empire, preceded by a transitional period known as the Principate between 31 and 27 BC. In 27 BC, Augustus relinquished his now extensive dictatorial powers in exchange for a co-opted senatorial recognition of the need of the Roman state for a figure to provide leadership and political inspiration to the government. In essence, Augustus's skill was to impose a personal government with extremely broad powers, disguising it as a restored republic by formally renouncing the exceptional offices typical of dictatorship, thus offending the sensibility of the aristocratic class, which had accepted the compromise of ceding political and military power in exchange for a guarantee of its social and economic privileges. Augustus promoted far-reaching political, economic, and social reforms throughout the empire, ensuring a stability that had long been lost. Throughout the 1st century, the empire continued to expand, particularly in northern Europe and the Middle East. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, to which Augustus belonged, came to an end in 68 AD with the death of Emperor Nero. There followed a year of intense conflict in the army to establish the succession. In the end, General Vespasian prevailed and established the Flavian dynasty. To legitimize his dynasty, he began a major renovation of the city of Rome, and in 80 AD, one of its most iconic monuments, the Colosseum, was inaugurated. Vespasian was succeeded by his sons Titus and Domitian, ending the Flavian dynasty at 96 AD. Over the years, numerous other emperors of different dynasties succeeded one another. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest extent with the conquest of Dacia and new territories in the east, 117 AD. Under the Antonine dynasty, 138 to 192 AD, there was a period of peace and prosperity, certainly culminating in the reign of Hadrian, a cultured emperor who traveled throughout the empire to improve the provinces. Toward the end of the 2nd century AD, however, the task of defending the empire's borders from the pressure of external enemies became increasingly urgent. The crisis of the Principate, which had already begun with the death of Marcus Aurelius, took shape with the rise of Septimius Severus, 193 to 211, and the reform of the institution of the Principate, which was now alienated from the dynamics of the senatorial sphere and dominated by those of the army. The military monarchy of Severus, 193 to 235, although at times reflecting the need for senatorial legitimation, was the prelude to the emergence of the dominate, 285 to 641, after the very dynamic period of military anarchy, 235 to 285. After the Severan dynasty, throughout the 3rd century, it was in fact the legions that proclaimed emperors, who often reigned for short periods and were constantly engaged in military campaigns to defend their borders against barbarian incursions and to maintain their power against internal rivals. To address the problems in the administration of the empire, Emperor Diocletian initiated a series of social, economic, and political reforms at the end of the 3rd century. The most important was the institution of the tetrarchy, which consisted of dividing the territory into 4 parts, each ruled by a separate administrator. There were two Augusti emperors which governed the empire on a geographical basis and were responsible for the defense of the frontiers and the fight against any usurpers. Augusti had deputies called Caesars who would take over in the event of their death, thus avoiding possible disputes over succession. The entire territory was reorganized from an administrative point of view, abolishing the division of provinces into imperial, i.e., those governed directly by the emperor, and senatorial, governed directly by the Senate, and creating 12 administrative districts called dioceses, governed by vicari, and in turn divided into 101 provinces. This was the first real division of the empire into two parts, one western and one eastern, but only a century later would there be a definitive separation of the two areas. The system finally seemed to work, but there were immediate problems with the succession mechanism. The successors of Diocletian and Maximian, the other Augustus, clashed, triggering a new civil war, which Constantine I won. Constantine's rise to power after the Battle of Ponte Milvio in 312 AD marked a turning point in the history of the Roman Empire. During the campaign against his rival Maxentius, Constantine had an experience which he described as a divine vision. According to Christian tradition, before the battle, Constantine saw a vision of the Christian symbol, the Chi, accompanied by the phrase, "In hoc signo vinces." After the victory, Constantine encouraged the spread of Christianity and liberalized all religions in the empire with the Edict of Milan in 313. Although the story of the battle is undoubtedly a propaganda legend, it is clear that Constantine was aware of the cultural and social changes taking place in the population, and especially in the military, and preferred to adopt this innovation to facilitate social control. Furthermore, in the east, Constantine I founded the new empire, Constantinople, in 330, now Istanbul, on the site of the city of Byzantium, destined to become the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The progressive adoption of the Christian religion, initiated by Constantine in 306 to 337, ended after periods of oscillation between proto-heretical choices, Constantius II 337 to 361, and attempts to restore traditional cults with the organization of an ecclesiastical institution parallel to the civil one, Julian 361 to 363, with the official adoption of Christianity in 380, with the Edict of Thessalonica promulgated by the Emperor Theodosius I, whose death in 395 also saw the definitive division of the empire into two parts, a western and an eastern, ruled respectively by the two sons of Theodosius, Honorius and Arcadius. By the end of the 4th century, however, the Roman Empire, in a state of inexorable political and economic crisis and unable to repel invasions, was forced to accept the settlement of Germanic barbarian peoples on its territories. By the 5th century, the Eastern and Western empires were firmly divided. In the Western Empire, now reduced almost entirely to Italy, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric I in 410 and by the Vandals under Genseric in 455. It was now the Germanic generals who defended the empire, wielding enormous power, going so far as to create and depose emperors at will. The pressure of the barbarian populations was now too great, and the final fall of Rome was only a matter of time. In 476, the barbarian king Odoacer deposed the Emperor Romulus Augustus, and the Eastern Emperor Julius Nepo recognized him as his imperial representative in Italy, marking the end of the Western Roman Empire, at least politically. As the Western Roman Empire came to an end, marked by internal and external challenges, it is important to remember that the Roman Empire continued its long history in its eastern part, the Eastern Roman Empire.